Chapter 2, Part 3 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 2, Part 3. Colonies in the Western Mediterranean. The earliest mention of Sicilian and Italian regions in literature is to be found in some later passages of the Odyssey, which should perhaps be referred to the 8th century. There we meet with the Sicels and with the island of Sicania, while Temesa, where Greek traders could buy Tuscan copper, has the distinction of being the first Italian place mentioned by name in a literary record. By the end of the 7th century, Greek states stood thick on the east coast of Sicily and round the sweep of the Tarentine Gulf. These colonies naturally fall into three groups. 1, the Euboean, which were both in Sicily and in Italy. 2, the Achaean, which were altogether on Italian soil. 3, the Dorian, which were, with few exceptions, in Sicily. The chronology is uncertain, and we cannot say whether the island or the mainland was first colonized. The oldest stories of the adventures of Odysseus were laid, as we have seen, in the half-explored regions of the Black Sea. Nothing shows more impressively the life of this poetry, and the power it had won over the hearts of the Greek folks, than the fact that when the navigation of the Italian and Sicilian seas began, these adventures were transferred from the east to the west, and in the further growth of this cycle of poems a new mythical geography was adopted. At a time when the Greeks knew so little of Italy that the southern promontories could be designated as sacred islands, [Footnote: The expression is preserved in the catalogue of the Hesiodic Theogony. End of footnote. The Straits of Messana were identified with Scylla and Charybdis. Lipara became the island of Aeolus. The home of the Cyclopes was found in the fiery mount of Etna. Then Scheria, the isle of the Phaeacians, was fancied to be Corcyra. An entrance to the underworld was placed at Cumae, and the rocks of the Sirens were sought near Sorrento. And not only did the first glimpses of Western geography affect the transmutation of the Odyssey into its final shape, but the Odyssey reacted on the geography of the West. That the promontory of Circeii in Latin territory bears the name of the sorceress of Colchis is an evidence of the spell of Homeric song. Odysseus was not the only hero who was borne westward with Greek ships in the 8th century. Cretan Minos and Daedalus, for example, had links with Sicily. Above all, the earliest navigation of the western seas was ascribed to Heracles, who reached the limits of the land of the setting sun, and stood on the ledge of the world looking out upon the stream of Oceanus. From him the opposite cliffs which form the gate of the Mediterranean were called the Pillars of Heracles. The earliest colony founded by Greek sailors in the western seas was said to have been Syme on the coast of Campania. Tradition assigned to it an origin before 1000 B.C., a date which modern criticism has called in question. But even if we place its origin much later, the tradition that it was the earliest Greek city founded in the middle peninsula of the Mediterranean may possibly be true. It was at all events one of the oldest, and it had an unique position. Chalcis, Eretria, and Syme, a town on the eastern coast of Euboea, which at that time had some eminence, but afterwards sank into the obscurity of a village, joined together and enlisted for their expedition some Grians who dwelled on the opposite mainland in the neighbourhood of Tanagra. The colonizers settled first on the island of Pithecusae, and soon succeeded in establishing themselves on a rocky height which rises above the sea just where the Italian coast is about to turn sharply eastward to encircle the Bay of Naples. The site was happily chosen. It was a strong post, and though there was no harbour, the strangers could haul up their ships on a stretch of sand below. Subsequently they occupied the harbour, which was just inside the promontory, and established there the town of Dicearchia, which afterwards became Puteoli. Farther east they founded Naples, the new city. The people in whose midst this outpost of Greek civilization was planted were the Opicans, one of the chief branches of the Italic race. The colonists were eminently successful in their intercourse with the natives, and the solitary position of Syme in these regions, for no Greek settlement could be made northward on account of the great Etruscan power, and there was no rival southward until the later plantation of Posidonia, made her influence both wide and noiseless. Her external history is uneventful. There are no striking wars or struggles to record, but the work she did holds an important and definite place in the history of European civilization. To the Euboeans of Syme we may say that we owe the alphabet which we use today, for it was from them that the Latins learned to write. The Etruscans also got their alphabet independently from the same masters, and having modified it in certain ways to suit themselves, passed it on to the Oscans and Umbrians. Again, the Cymeans introduced the neighbouring Italian peoples to a knowledge of the Greek gods and Greek religion. Heracles, Apollo, Castor, and Polydeuces became such familiar names in Italy that they came to be regarded as original Italian deities. The oracles of the Cymean Sibyl, prophetess of Apollo, were believed to contain the destinies of Rome. To Syme, too, Western Europe probably owes the name by which she calls Hellas and the Hellenes. The Greeks, when they first came into contact with Latins, had no common name. Hellenes, the name which afterwards united them, was as yet merely associated with a particular tribe. It was only natural that strangers should extend the name of the first Greeks with whom they came in contact to others whom they fell in with later, and so to all Greeks whatsoever. But the curious circumstance is that the settlers of Syme were known not by the name of Chalcis or Eretria or Syme itself, but by that of Graia. Graiae was the term which the Latins and their fellows applied to the colonists, and the name Graecae is a derivative of a usual type from Graiae. It was doubtless some trivial accident which ruled that we today call Hellas Greece, instead of knowing it by some name derived from Syme, Eretria, or Chalcis. The West has got its Greece from an obscure district in Boeotia. Greece itself got its Hellas from a small territory in Thessaly. This was accidental, but it was no accident that Western Europe calls Greece by a name connected with that city in which Greeks first came into touch with the people who were destined to civilize Western Europe and rule it for centuries. The next settlement of the Euboean Greeks was on Sicilian, not Italian ground. The island of Sicily is geographically a continuation of Italy, just as the Peloponnesus is a continuation of the great Eastern Peninsula, but its historical importance depends much more on another geographical fact. It is the centre of the Mediterranean. It parts the eastern from the western waters. It has been thus marked out by nature as a meeting place of nations, and the struggle between European and Asiatic peoples, which has been called the eternal question, has been partly fought out on Sicilian soil. There has been in historical times no native Sicilian power. The greatness of the island was due to colonization, not migration, from other lands. Lying as a connecting link between Europe and Africa, it attracted settlers from both sides, while its close proximity to Italy always rendered it an object of acquisition to those who successively ruled in that peninsula. The earliest inhabitants of the island were the Sicans. They believed themselves to be autochthonous, and we have no record at what time they entered the island, or whence they came, or to what race they belonged. The nature of things makes it probable that they entered from Italy. From them the island was called Sicania. The next comers were the Sicels, of whom we can speak with more certainty. As we find Sicels in the toe of Italy, we know that tradition correctly described them as settlers from the Italian peninsula, and there is some slight evidence to show that they spoke the same language as that group of Italic peoples to which the Latins belonged. The likeness of the names Sicel and Sican has naturally led to the view that these two folks were akin in race and language. But likeness of names is deceptive, and it is a remarkable fact that the Greeks, who were only too prone to build up theories on resemblances of words, always carefully distinguished the Sican from the Sicel as ethnically different. Still, a connection is possible, if we suppose that the Sicels were Sicans who, remaining behind in Italy, had in the course of centuries become italicized by intercourse with the Latin and kindred peoples, and then, emigrating in their turn to the island, met without recognition the brethren from whom they had parted in the remote past. But all this is uncertain. The Sicels, however, wrested from the Sicans the eastern half of the island, which was thus cut up into two countries, Sicania in the west, Sicily in the east. In the Odyssey we read of Sicania. Perhaps the Greeks of Cyme knew it by this name. At a very early time Sicania was invaded by a mysterious people named Elymians, variously said to have come from Italy and from the north of Asia Minor. The probability is that they were of Iberian race. They occupied a small territory in the northwest of the island. These were the three peoples who inhabited this miniature continent, soon about to become the battlefield of Greek and Phoenician. The Sicels were the most numerous and most important. The only Sican town of any significance in historical times was Hycara on the northwest promontory. Minoa, originally Sican on the south coast, became Greek. Chamicus, at some distance inland in the same region, was in early days an important stronghold. The Elymian settlements at Segesta and Eryx became of far greater importance than the Sican. The eastern half of the isle, the original Sicilia, was thickly set with Sicel fortresses from Cephalledium, the modern Cefalù, at the centre of the northern coast, to Motica, an inland town in the southeastern corner. Among the most famous were Agirium, Centuripa, Morgantina, and, above all, Henna. At an early age merchants from Phoenicia planted factories on the coasts of the island. At first they did not make any settlements of a permanent kind, any that could be called cities. For Sicily was to them only a house to call at, lying directly on their way to the land of the farthest west, when they went forth to win the golden treasures of Tarshish, and planted their earliest colony, Gades, outside the straits which divide Europe from Africa. Their next colonies were on the coast of Africa, over against Sicily, and this settlement had a decisive influence on the destinies of the island. The Phoenician trading stations on the east coast of Sicily were probably outposts of old Phoenicia, but some at least of those in the west seem to have come from the new and nearer Phoenicia. The settlements of Hippo and Utica, older than Carthage, were probably the parents of the more abiding Phoenician settlements in Sicily. [Footnote: There is no clear evidence for the date of the Phoenician colonies in western Sicily. It might be argued that they were later than the Greek colonies, on the ground that the Phoenicians, if their colonization had begun earlier than Greek colonization, would have occupied the excellent sites which the Greeks seized. But this argument is not conclusive. For one thing, the Sicels had to be reckoned with. It was probably an easier task to gain a footing on Sican soil, and the Phoenicians may have tried and failed on Sicel soil, where the Greeks succeeded. Or again, if Phoenician city settlements grew out of mere factories, the Greeks may have abolished such factories, which might, if they had been left to themselves, have grown into cities. End of footnote. In the east of the island the Phoenicians had no secure foothold. They were not able to dispossess the Sicel natives or to make a home among them. They appeared purely in the guise of traders. Hence, when the Greeks came and seriously set to work to plant true cities, the Phoenicians disappeared and left few traces to show that they had ever been there. Sicilian, like Italian history, really opens with the coming of the Greeks. They came under the guidance of Chalcis and the auspices of Apollo. It was naturally on the east coast, which faces Greece, that the first Greek settlement was made, and it is to be noticed that of the coasts of Sicily the east is that which most resembles in character the coastline of Greece. The site which was chosen by the Chalcidians and the Ionians of Naxos who accompanied them was not a striking one. A little tongue of land, north of Mount Etna, very different from the height of Syme, was selected for the foundation of Naxos. Here, as in the case of Syme, the Chalcidians who led the enterprise surrendered the honour of naming the new city to their less prominent fellow-founders. The first of all the Greek towns of Sicily, Naxos was not destined to live for much more than 300 years. It was to be destroyed not by the fire of the dangerous mountain which dominated it, but by a human foe. A sort of consecration was always attached to Naxos as the first homestead of the Hellenes in the island, which was to become a brilliant part of Hellas. To Apollo Archegetes an altar was erected on the spot where the Greeks first landed, driven, as the legend told, by contrary winds, through Apollo's dispensation to the Sicilian shores. It was the habit of ambassadors from old Greece, as soon as they arrived in Sicily, to offer sacrifice on this altar. In the fertile plain south of Etna, the Chalcidians soon afterwards founded Catani, close to the sea and protected by a low range of hills behind, but under the power of Etna, which was to unmake the place again and again; and inland Leontini, at the south end of her plain between two hills, with an eastern and a western acropolis. These sites, Leontini certainly, if not Catani, were wrested from the Sicels. The Chalcidians also won possession of the northeast corner, and thus obtained command of the straits between the island and the mainland. Here Cymians and Chalcidians planted Zancli on a low rim of land which resembles a reaping hook, and gave the place its name. The haven is formed by the curving blade, and when Zancli came in after days to mint money, she engraved on her coins a sickle representing her harbour, and a dolphin floating within it. 100 years later the city was transformed by the immigration of a company of Messenians, and ultimately the old local name was ousted in favour of Messana. From Zancli the Euboeans established the fortress of Mylae on the other side of the northeastern promontory, and in the middle of the 7th century they founded Himera, the only Greek city on the northern coast, destined to live for scarce 2 centuries and a half, and then to be swept away by the Phoenician. It was important for Zancli that the land over against her, the extreme point of the Italian peninsula, should be in friendly hands, and therefore the men of Zancli incited their mother city to found Rhegion, and in this foundation Messenians took part. While this group of Chalcidian colonies was being formed in northeastern Sicily, Dorian Greeks began to obtain a footing in southeastern Sicily, which history decided should become the Dorian Quarter. The earliest of the Dorian cities was also the greatest. Syracuse, destined to be the head of Greek Sicily, was founded by Corinthian emigrants under the leadership of Archias before the end of the 8th century. Somewhere about the same time Corinth also colonized Corcyra. The Ionian islands were halfway stations to the west. Which colony was the elder we know not. Tradition did not attempt to decide, for it placed both in the same year. But in both cases Corinth had to dispossess previous Greek settlers, and in both cases the previous settlers were Euboeans. Her colonists had to drive Eretrians from Corcyra and Chalcidians from Syracuse. The great haven of Syracuse, with its island and its hill, formed the most striking sight on the east coast, and could not fail to invite the earliest colonists. Chalcidians occupied the island of Ortygia, Isle of Quails, as it was called. They must have won it from the Sicel, or possibly from the Phoenician, and held it long enough to associate it forever with the name of a fountain in their old home, Arethusa. It is highly probable that the Chalcidian occupation was effected very soon after that of Naxos, and it is possible that the Corinthians did not supersede the Chalcidians till many years later. But when they once held Syracuse, they effectively prevented any Chalcidian expansion south of Leontini. At an early date Megarians also sailed into the west to find a new home. After various unsuccessful attempts to establish themselves, they finally built their city on the coast north of Syracuse, beside the hills of Hybla, and perhaps Sicel natives joined in founding the Western Megara. It was the most northerly Dorian town on the east coast. But, like her mother, the Hyblaean Megara was destined to found a colony more famous than herself. In the middle of the 7th century the Megarians sent to their metropolis to invite co-operation in planting a settlement in the southwestern part of the island. This settlement, which was to be the farthest outpost of Greek Sicily, was Selinus, the town named of wild celery, as its own coins boasted, situated on a low hill on the coast. Megara had been occupied with the good will of the Sicel. Selinus was probably held at the expense of the Sican. In the meantime the southeastern corner was being studded with Dorian cities, though they did not rise by any means so rapidly as the Chalcidian in the north. The Sicels seem to have offered a stouter resistance here. At the beginning of the 7th century, Gela, the name is Sicel, was planted by Rhodian colonists with Cretans in their train. This city was set on a long, narrow hill which stretched between the sea and an inland plain. At a later time Acre and Casmene were founded by Syracuse. They were overshadowed by the greatness of the mother city, and never attained as much independence as more distant Camarina, which was planted from the same metropolis about half a century later. The latest Dorian colony of Sicily was only less conspicuous than the first. The Geloans sought an east from their Rhodian metropolis and founded, halfway between their own city and Selinus, the lofty town of Acragas, which soon took the second place in Greek Sicily and became the rival of Syracuse. It was perched on a high hill near the sea-shore. The small poor haven was at some distance from the town. Flock-feeding Acragas never became a maritime power. The symbols on its coins were the eagle and the crab. In planting their colonies and founding their domination in Sicily, the Greeks had mainly to reckon with the Sicels. In their few foundations in the farther west they had to deal with the Sicans. These older inhabitants were forced to retire from the coasts, but they lived on in their fortresses on the inland hills. The island was too large and its character too continental to invite the newcomers to attempt to conquer the whole of it. With the Phoenicians the Greeks had no trouble. Their factories and temples had not taken root in the soil, and on the landing of a stranger who was resolved to take root they vanished. Traces of their worship sometimes remained, here as in the Aegean, but they did not abandon the western corner of the island where the Greeks did not attempt to settle. There they maintained 3 places which now assumed the character of cities. These were Panormus, Solus, and Motia, the haven, the rock, and the island. Panormus, or All Haven, in a fertile plain, is protected on the north by Mount Hercte, now the Pilgrim Mount, and on the east by Solus. Motia is on an island in a small bay on the west coast. The Elymian country lay between Motia and Panormus. The chief town of the Elymians, Segesta, which in Greek mouths became Egesta, was essentially a city, while Eryx, farther west, high above the sea but not actually on it, was their outpost of defence. On Eryx they worshipped some goddess of nature, soon to be identified with the Greek Aphrodite. The Elymians were on good terms with the Phoenicians, and western Sicily became a Phoenician corner. While the inland country was left to Sicel and Sican, the coasts were to be the scene of struggles between Phoenician and Greek. And here the natural position of the combatants was reversed, for the Asiatic power was in the west and the European in the east. In the 7th century this struggle was still a long way off. Sicily was still large enough to hold both the Greek and the Canaanite in peace. The name by which we know the central of the 3 great peninsulas of the Mediterranean did not extend as far north as the Po in the time of Julius Caesar, and originally it covered a very small area indeed. In the 5th century Thucydides applies the name Italy to the modern Calabria, the western of the 2 extremities into which the peninsula divides. This extremity was inhabited when the Greeks first visited it by Sicels and Oenotrians, but the heel was occupied by peoples of that Illyrian race which had played, as we dimly see, a decisive part in the earliest history of the Greeks. The Illyrian was now astride of the Adriatic. He had reached Italy before the Greek. The Calabrians, who gave their name to the heel, were of Illyrian stock, and along with these were the Messapians, some of whose brethren on the other side of the water seem to have thrown in their fortunes with the Greeks and penetrated into Locris and Boeotia, and perhaps into the Peloponnesus. It was on the seaboard of the Sicels and Oenotrians that the Achaeans of the Peloponnesus, probably towards the close of the 8th century, found a field for colonization. It has been already remarked that the Ionian Islands are a sort of stepping stone to the west, and just as we find Corinthians settling in Corcyra, so we find Achaeans settling in Zacynthus. The first colonies which they planted in Italy were perhaps Sybaris and Croton, famous for their wealth and their rivalry. Sybaris, on the river Crathis, in an unhealthy but most fruitful plain, soon extended her dominion across the narrow peninsula, and, founding the settlements of Laos and Sidros on the western coast, commanded 2 seas. Thus, having in her hands an overland route to the western Mediterranean, she could forward to her ports on the Tyrrhenian Sea the valuable merchandise of the Milesians, whom Chalcidian jealousy excluded from the straits between Italy and Sicily. Thus both agriculture and traffic formed the basis of the remarkable wealth of Sybaris, and the result was an elaboration of luxury which caused the Sybarite name to pass into a proverb. Posidonia, famous for its temples and its roses, was another colony on the western sea, founded from Sybaris. It is said to have been formed by Trezenians, who were driven out from that city by the Achaeans. A good way to the south of Sybaris you come to Croton, before the coast, in its southern trend, has yet reached the Licinian promontory, on which a stately temple of Hera formed a central place of worship for the Greek settlers in Italy. Unlike the other Achaean colonies, Croton had a good harbour, the only good harbour on the west side of the Gulf, but her prosperity, like that of her fellows, rested not on maritime traffic, but on the cultivation of land and the rearing of cattle. The Delphic god seems to have taken a more than wonted interest in the foundation of this city, if we may judge from the Delphic tripod which appears on its earliest coins. Like Sybaris, Croton widened its territory and planted colonies of its own. On the Tyrrhenian Sea, Tyrrhena and Temesa were to Croton what Laos and Cydros were to Sybaris.
[Footnote: Another colony of Croton was Pandosia, and it conquered the Ionian town of Seletion or Silesium. End of footnote.]
Caulonia, perhaps also a Crotoniate settlement, was the most southerly Achaean colony, and was the neighbour of the western Locriae. This town was founded in the territory of the Sicels, it is not certain by which of the three Locrian states. Perhaps it was a joint enterprise of all three. It was agricultural, like its Achaean neighbours, and like them it pushed over to the western sea and founded Medma and Hipponion on the other coast. The Achaeans and Locrians might quarrel among themselves, but they had more in common with each other than either had with the Dorians, and we may conveniently include Locriae in the Achaean group. Thus the southern coast of Italy would have been almost a homogeneous circle if a Dorian colony had not been established in a small sheltered bay at the extreme north point of the Gulf, to which it gave the name it still bears, Terrace or Tarentum. Terrace was remarkable as the only foreign settlement ever made by the greatest of all the Dorian peoples. The town, called like Sybaris after the name of a neighbouring stream, was founded by the Parthenii, a name which has not yet been explained. There are reasons for thinking that these first founders were pre-Dorian Greeks from the Peloponnesus, but Laconian settlers occupied the place at some unknown date and made of it a Dorian city. A legend then grew up which connected the Parthenii with Sparta, and a historical episode, taking various forms, was manufactured. It was said that in a war with the Messenians, when the Spartans were for many years absent from home, the women bore sons to Helots, and that this progeny, called Parthenii, or maidens' children, conspired against the state, and, being driven out of the country, were directed by the oracle to settle at Terrace. The hero Phalanthus, who seems to have been originally a local sea god, degraded to the rank of a hero at the coming of Poseidon, was worshipped by the Tarentines, and his ride overseas on a dolphin was represented on their coins. The framers of the story of the Parthenii made him the leader of the colonists from Laconia. The prosperity of the Tarentines depended partly on the cultivation of a fruitful territory, but mainly on their manufacturing industry. Their fabrics and dyed wools became renowned, and their pottery was widely diffused. Terrace, in fact, must be regarded as an industrial rather than as an agricultural state. Her position brought her into contact with inhabitants of the Calabrian peninsula, and she had a foe in the Messapian town of Brundusium. She founded the colonies of Callipolis and Hydrus on the eastern coast, where she had no Greek rivals. But on the other side her possible advance was foreseen and hindered by the prudence of the Sybarites. They feared lest the Dorian city might creep round the coast and occupy the fertile lands which are watered by the Bradanus and the Siris. So they induced the Achaeans of Old Greece to found a colony at Metapontion on the Bradanus, a place which had derived its name from Messapian settlers, and this, the most northerly of the Achaean cities, flourished as an agricultural community and cut off the westward expansion of Terrace. But in the meantime another rival seized the very place from which the Achaeans had desired to exclude the Dorians. In the middle of the 7th century Colophonians planted a colony at Cyrus, and this Ionian state threatened to interrupt the Achaean line of cities and cut off Metapontion from her sisters. This solitary instance of an Ionian attempt to found a colony at this period in these regions is rendered interesting through the probability that the poet Archilochus took part in the expedition. But the attempt seems to have failed. There are reasons for thinking, though the evidence is not clear, that the place was seized by its Achaean neighbours and became an Achaean town. Cyrus, like Sybaris, Croton, and Locri, had her helpmate, though not a daughter, on the Tyrrhenian Sea. By the persuasion of common interest she formed a close connection with Pixus. The two cities issued common coins, and perhaps organized a rival overland route. Thus the western coast of the Tarentine Gulf was beset with a line of Achaean cities, flanked at one extremity by western Locri, on the other by Dorian Terrace. The common feature which distinguished them from the cities settled by the men of Chalcis and Corinth was that their wealth depended on the mainland, not on the sea. Their rich men were landowners, not merchants. It was not traffic, but rich soil that had originally lured them to the far west. The unwarlike Sicels and Enotrians seem to have laid no obstacles in the way of their settlements, and to have submitted to their rule. The Iapygians and Messapians of Calabria were of different temper, and it is significant that it was men from warlike Sparta who succeeded in establishing Terrace. These cities, with their dependencies beyond the hills, on the shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea, came to be regarded as a group, and the country came to be called Great Hellas. We might rather have looked to find it called Great Achaia, by contrast to the old Achaean lands in Greece. But here, as in other cases, it is the name of a lesser folk which prevails. If the Hellenes, the old Greek inhabitants of the plain of the Spercheius, had been conquered by the Achaeans, the conquest was forgotten, and the two peoples had gone forth together to found new cities in the west. And here the Hellenic name rose to celebrity and honour. It was no small thing in itself that the belt of Greek settlements on the Tarentine Gulf should come to be called Great Hellas, but it was a small thing compared with the extension of the name Hellenes to designate all peoples of Greek race. There was nothing to lead the Greeks of their own accord to fix on Hellenes as a common name. If they had sought such a name deliberately, their natural choice would have been Achaeans, which Homer had already used in a wide sense. The name must have been given to them from without. Just as the barbarian peoples in central Italy had taken hold of the name of the Graees, so the barbarians in the southern peninsulas took hold of the name of the Hellenes, and used it to denote all settlers and strangers of the same race. Such a common name, applied by barbarian lips to them all alike, brought home to Greek traders the significance of their common race, and they adopted the name themselves as the conjugate of barbarians. So the name Hellenes, obscure when it had gone forth to the west, travelled back to the east in a new sense, and won its way into universal use. The fictitious ancestor Hellene became the forefather of the whole Greek race, and the fictitious ancestors of the Dorians, Ionians, and Aeolians were all derived from him. The original Hellenes lost their separate identity as completely as the original Aeolians and Ionians had lost theirs, but their name was destined to live for ever in the speech of men, while those of their greater fellows had passed into a memory. End of chapter 2, part 3.
Recording by Graham Redman. Chapter 2, Parts 4 to 8 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 2, Part 4. Growth of Trade and Maritime Enterprise. The age of the aristocratic republics saw the face of the Greek world completely transformed. The colonial expansion of Greece eastward and westward was itself part of this transformation, but it also helped signally to bring about other changes. For, while the colonies were politically independent of their mother states, they reacted in many ways on the mother country. We have seen how the system of family property was favourable to colonial enterprise. But the colonists who had suffered under that system were not likely to introduce it in their new settlements, and thus the institution of personal land ownership was probably first established and regulated in the colonies. Their example reacted on the mother country, where other natural causes were also gradually undermining the family system. In the first place, as the power of the state grew greater, the power of the family grew less, and when the head of the state, whether king or republican government, was felt as a formidable authority, the prestige of the head of the family, overshadowed by the power of the state, became insensibly weaker. In the second place, it was common to assign a portion of an estate to one member of the family to manage and enjoy the undivided use of it. And although it did not become his, and he had no power of disposing of it, yet the natural tendency would have been to allow it on his death to pass to his son on the same conditions. It is clear that such a practice tended to the ultimate establishment of personal proprietorship of the soil. Again, side by side with the undivided family estate, personal properties were actually acquired. At this period there was much wild, unallotted land, which wild beasts haunt, especially on the hill slopes, and when a man of energy reclaimed a portion of this land for tillage, the new fields became his own, for they had belonged to no man. We can thus see generally how inevitable it was that the old system should disappear, and the large family estates break up into private domains. But the change was not accomplished by legislation, and the gradual process by which it was brought about is withdrawn from our eyes. It was only when private land ownership had become an established fact that the law came in and recognized it by regulating sales of land and allowing men to bequeath it freely. The Boeotian poet Hesiod has given us a picture of rural life in Greece at this period. He was a husbandman himself near Astra, where his father, who had come as a stranger from Syme in Aeolis, had put under cultivation a strip of waste land on the slopes of Helicon. The farm was divided between his two sons Perses and Hesiod, but in unequal shares, and Hesiod accuses Perses of winning the larger moiety by bribing the lords of the district. But Perses managed his farm badly, and it did not prosper. Hesiod wrote his poem, The Works, to teach such unthrifty farmers as his brother true principles of agriculture and economy. His view of life is profoundly gloomy, and suggests a condition of grave social distress in Boeotia. This must have been mainly due to the oppression of the nobles, gift-devouring princes, as he calls them. The poet looks back to the past with regret. The Golden Age, the Silver, and the Bronze have all gone by, and the age of the heroes who fought at Troy.
and mankind is now in the Iron Age, and will never cease by day or night from weariness and woe. Would that I did not live in this generation, would that I had died before, or were born hereafter." The poem gives minute directions for the routine of the husbandman's work, the times and tides of sowing and reaping, and the other labours of the field, the fashion of the implements of tillage, and all this is accompanied by maxims of proverbial wisdom. Apart from the value of his poem as a social picture, Hesiod has a great significance as the first spokesman of the common folk. In the history of Europe his is the first voice raised from among the toiling classes and claiming the interest of mankind in their lot. It is a voice indeed of acquiescence, counselling fellow toilers to make the best of an evil case. The stage of revolt has not yet been reached. But the grievances are aired, and the lords who wield the power are exhorted to deal just judgments, that the land may prosper. The new poet is, in form and style, under the influence of the Homeric poems, but he is acutely conscious that he is striking new notes and has new messages for men. He comes forward, unlike Homer, in his own person. He contrasts himself with Homer when he claims that the Muses can teach truth as well as beautiful fiction. In his other poem, the Theogony, he tells us that the daughters of Zeus taught Hesiod as he fed sheep on the hillsides of Helicon. They gave him for staff a branch of bay. The staff was now the minstrel's emblem, for the epic poems were no longer sung to the lyre, but were recited by the rhapsode, standing with a staff in his hand. Then the Muses breathed into the shepherd of Askra the wizard power of declaring the future and the past, and set him the task of singing the race of the blessed gods. In the Theogony he performs this task. He sings how the world was made, the gods and the earth, the rivers and the ocean, the stars and the heaven, how in infinite space which was at the beginning there arose earth and Tartarus, and love, the cosmic principle. And it is notable how he introduces amongst the eldest born powers of the world such abstractions as love itself, memory, sleep. These speculations on the origin of the universe and the attempt to work up the popular myths into a system mark a new stage in the intellectual development of Greece. The Theogony produced a whole school of bards, who merged their identity under the name of Hesiod, and as we have seen, these Hesiodic poems had a decisive influence in moulding the ideas of the Greeks as to the early history of their race. Boeotia was always an unenterprising country of husbandmen, and Hesiod had no sympathy with trade or foreign venture, though his father had come from Aeolis. But the growth of trade was the most important fact of the time, and here too the colonies reacted on the mother country. By enlarging the borders of the Greek world they invited and facilitated the extension of Greek trade, and promoted the growth of industries. Hitherto the Greeks had been mainly an agricultural and pastoral people. Many of them were now becoming industrial. They had to supply their western colonies with oil and wool, with metal and pottery, and they began to enter into serious competition with the Phoenician trader, and to drive eastern goods from the market. Greek trade moved chiefly along waterways, and this is illustrated by the neglect of road-making in Greece. There were no paved roads, even in later times, except the sacred ways to frequented sanctuaries, like that from Athens to Eleusis and Delphi, or that from the sea-coast to Olympia. Yet the Greeks were still timorous navigators, and it was deemed hazardous to sail even in the most familiar waters except in the late summer. Hesiod expresses in vivid verses the general fear of the sea. For 50 days after the solstice, till the end of the harvest, is the tide for sailing. Then you will not wreck your ship, nor will the sea wash down your crew, unless Poseidon or Zeus wills their destruction. In that season winds are steady and ocean kind. With mind at rest launch your ship and stow your freight. But make all speed to return home, and await not the new wine and the rain of the vintage tide, when the winter approaches, and the terrible south wind stirs the waves, in fellowship with the heavy autumnal rain of Zeus, and makes the sea cruel. About this time, however, an important advance was made in seacraft by the discovery of the anchor. Seafaring states found it needful to build warships for protection against pirates. The usual type of the early Greek warship was the Pentaconta, or 50-oar, a long, narrow galley with 25 benches, on each of which 2 oarsmen sat. The Pentaconta hardly came into use in Greece before the 8th century. The Homeric Greeks had only smaller vessels of 20 oars, but we can see in the Homeric poems the Pentaconta coming within their ken as a strange and wonderful thing. The ocean deity Briareos, called by the name of the Agean, appears in the Iliad, and he is probably no other than the new racer of the seas sped by 100 hands. In the Odyssey the Phaeacians, who are the kings of seacraft, have ships of 50 oars. But before the end of the 8th century a new idea revolutionized shipbuilding in Phoenicia. Vessels were built with 2 rows of benches, one above the other, so that the number of oarsmen and the speed were increased, without adding to the length of the ship. The bireme, however, never became common in Greece, for the Phoenicians had soon improved it into the trireme by the superposition of another bank of oars. [Footnote: The secret of building this kind of galley has been lost. Modern shipwrights cannot reproduce a trireme. In later times the Greeks built ships of many banks, 5, 10, even 40. End of footnote. The trireme, propelled by 170 rowers, was ultimately to come into universal use as the regular Greek warship, though for a long time after its first introduction by the Corinthians the old Pentacontas were still generally used. But the unknown shipwright who invented the bireme deserves the credit of the new idea. Whatever naval battles were fought in the 7th century were fought mainly, we may be sure, with Pentacontas, but Pentacontas and triremes alike were affected by the new invention of the bronze ram on the prow, a weapon of attack which determined the future character of Greek naval warfare. The Greeks believed that the first regular sea fight between 2 Greek powers was fought before the middle of the 7th century, between Corinth and her daughter city Corcyra. If the tradition is true, we may be sure that the event was an incident in a struggle for the trade with Italy and Sicily and along the Adriatic coasts. The chief competitors, however, with Corinth in the west, were the Euboean cities, Chalcis and Eretria. In the traffic in eastern seas, the island city of Aegina, though she had no colonies of her own, took an active part, and became one of the richest mercantile states of Greece. Athens too had ships, but her industries were still on a comparatively small scale, and it was not till a much later period that her trade was sufficient to involve her in serious rivalry with her neighbours. But the most active of all in industry and commerce were the Greeks of Ionia. End of chapter 2, part 4. Chapter 2, part 5. Influence of Lydia on Greece. The Greeks of the Asiatic coast were largely dependent, for good or evil, on the adjacent inland countries. The inland trade added to their prosperity, but at any moment, if a strong barbarian power arose, their independence might be gravely menaced. At the beginning of the 7th century active intercourse was maintained between the Greeks and the kingdoms of Phrygia and Maeonia. The Phrygian king Midas dedicated a throne to the god of Delphi. Both the Phrygians and the Lydians adopted the Greek alphabet, while the Greeks adopted their modes of music and admitted Phrygian legends into Greek mythology. A considerable Phrygian element had won its way into Lydia and had gained the upper hand. In the Homeric poems we nowhere read of Lydians, but only of Maeonians, and there can be no doubt that this name represents the Phrygian settlers or conquerors. A Maeonian dynasty ruled in Lydia at the beginning of the 7th century, and the king bears a Maeonian name, Candoles, hound-choker. The Aryan conquerors, that is, who spoke an Aryan tongue, had occupied the throne for centuries, and Greek tradition afterwards derived the origin of the family of Candoles from Heracles himself. But they had become degenerate, and Gyges, a native Lydian of the clan of the Myrmidai, succeeded in slaying Candoles and seizing the crown. This revolution ushered in a new period for the Lydian, as it was now called, no longer Maeonian, kingdom. The dominion of the Maeonian sovereign had probably extended southward to the valley of the Meander. Gyges extended his power northward to the shores of the Propontis, where he founded Deucalion and conquered the Troad. But he also designed to make the Aegean his western boundary, and bring the Greek cities under his lordship. He pressed down the valley of the Hermus against Smyrna, down the valley of the Caister against Colophon, down the valley of the Meander against Miletus and Magnesia. Of these enterprises only the faintest hints have come down to us. It may be that Colophon was actually captured, and perhaps Magnesia, but the other cities beat back the enemy. The poet Mimnermus sings how a warrior, perhaps his own grandfather, wrought havoc in the ranks of the Lydian horsemen in the plain of the Hermus. But the plans of Gyges against his Greek neighbours were suddenly interrupted by a blow which descended as it were from the other side of the world upon Greeks and Lydians alike. The regions round about Lake Meotis on the northern coast of the Black Sea were inhabited by the Cimmerians, who appear in the marvellous wanderings of Odysseus. They were now driven forth from their abodes, to which, however, their name clung and still clings, by a Scythian folk, the Scoloti, who came from the east. Homeless, the Cimmerians wandered to the opposite side of the Euxine, but whether they travelled by the eastern or the western route, by the Caucasus or by the Danube, is not known for certain. On one hand they seem to have appeared first in eastern Asia Minor, on the other they seem to have associated with themselves some Thracian peoples, the Triarians, Edonians, and Thynians. The truth may be that they came round by the eastern coast, and that afterwards, when they made their incursions into western Asia Minor, they invited allies from Thrace to help them. Having defeated the Milesians of Sinope, they chose this place to be their chief settlement. They ventured to attack the great Assyrian Empire, and King Esarhaddon himself tells how "I smote the Cimmerian Teucer with all his army." But they overthrew the realm of Phrygia under its last king Midas, and towards the middle of the 7th century they attacked Lydia. To meet this danger, Gyges sought help from Assyria. The warlike Esarhaddon had been succeeded at Nineveh by Assurbanipal, a peaceful and literary prince, whose refined luxury is caricatured in the Greek conception of Sardanapalus. The lord of Lydia acknowledged the overlordship of the lord of Assyria. He gained a victory over the Cimmerians, and sent their chiefs in chains to Nineveh. But he did not long brook to be the vassal of another sovereign. He threw off his allegiance to Assyria, and sent Ionian and Carian mercenary soldiers to Egypt, to help that country also to free itself from Assyrian dominion. At this moment, perhaps, Gyges was at the height of his power. His wealth was famous, and he too, like Phrygian Midas, sent gifts, among them 6 golden mixing bowls, to the Delphian god. The poet Archilochus, who witnessed his career, sings defiantly that he cares not for the wealth of golden Gyges. But the Cimmerians presently renewed their attack, and fortune changed. Gyges was slain in battle, his capital Sardis was taken except the citadel, and it was some satisfaction to Assurbanipal to record that Lydia was in the hands of the Cimmerians. It was not long before they swooped down upon the Greek cities. Calinus, a poet of Ephesus, heard the trample of their horses and roused his fellow citizens to battle. Ephesus defied their attack, but the temple of Artemis outside the walls was burned down. They and their allies from Thrace destroyed Magnesia on the Meander. The barbarians made a deep impression. The swords which they swept down upon their enemies were enormous. They were equipped with large quivers and wore the curved caps of the Scythians. Fierce hounds ran with their horses. Such was their appearance as they were portrayed by a Greek artist of a later generation on a painted sarcophagus found at Clazomene. But the danger passed away. Ardys succeeded Gyges on the Lydian throne, and he finally not only drave out the Cimmerians from the land, but perhaps succeeded in extending his power into Cappadocia as far as the Halys. In the meantime Lydia had made an invention which revolutionized commerce. It is to Lydia that Europe owes the invention of coinage. The Babylonians, Phoenicians, and Egyptians made use of weighed gold and silver as a medium of exchange, a certain ratio being fixed between the two metals. A piece of weighed metal becomes a coin when it is stamped by the state and is thereby warranted to have its professed weight and purity. This step was first taken in Lydia, where the earliest money was coined somewhere about the beginning of the 7th century, probably by Gyges. These Lydian coins were made of the native white gold, or electron, a mixture of gold and silver in which the proportion of gold was greater. A bar of the white gold of Sardis was regarded as 10 times the value of a silver bar, and 3/4 of the value of a gold bar of the same weight. [Footnote: The Lydians had 2 scales, one for domestic intercourse based on a standard which they derived from Babylonia, and one for foreign commerce based on a standard derived from Phoenicia through the Greeks. End of footnote. Miletus and Samos soon adopted the new invention, which then spread to other Asiatic towns. Then Aegina and the 2 great cities of Euboea instituted monetary systems, and by degrees all the states of Greece gave up the primitive custom of estimating value in heads of cattle, and most of them had their own mints. As gold was very rare in Greece, not being found except in the islands of Sifnos and Thasos, the Greeks coined in silver. This invention, coming at the very moment when the Greeks were entering upon a period of great commercial activity, was of immense importance, not only in facilitating trade, but in rendering possible the accumulation of capital. Yet it took many generations to supersede completely the old methods of economy by the new system. The Greeks had derived their systems of weight from Babylonia and Phoenicia, but when Aegina and the Euboean cities fixed the standard of their silver coinage, they did not adopt the silver standard of either of those countries. The heavier statia, as the standard silver coin was named of Aegina, weighed 192 grains, and slightly exceeded a florin in value, and this system was adopted throughout the Peloponnese and in northern Greece. The lighter statia of Euboea weighed 130 grains, which was the Babylonian standard of gold. This system, at first confined to Euboea, Samos, and a few other places, was adopted in the 7th century by Corinth in a modified form, and afterwards by Athens. It was highly characteristic of the Greeks that their coinage was marked from the beginning by religious associations, and it has been supposed that the priests of their temples had an important share in initiating the introduction of money. It was in the shrines of their gods that men were accustomed to store their treasures for safe keeping. The gods themselves possessed costly dedications, and thus the science of weighing the precious metals was naturally studied by the priesthoods. Every coin which a Greek state issued bore upon it a reference to some deity. In early times this reference always took the shape of a symbol. In later times the head of the god was often represented. The Lydian coins of Sardis, the coins of Miletus and other Ionian cities bore a lion, those of Eretria showed a cow with a sucking calf, Aegina displayed a tortoise, and Cyzicus a tunnyfish, and all these tokens were symbols of the goddess who, whether under the name of Aphrodite or Hera or Artemis, was identified by the Greeks with Astarte of Phoenicia. End of chapter 2, part 5. Chapter 2, part 6. The opening of Egypt. Thus the merchants of Miletus and her fellows grew rich. They were the intermediaries between Lydia and the Mediterranean, while the Lydians carried their wares to the interior parts of Asia Minor and the Far East. Their argosies sailed to the far west as well as to the coasts of the Euxine. But a new field for winning wealth was opened to them, much about the same time as the invention of coinage revealed a new prospect to the world of commerce. The jealously guarded gates of Egypt were unbarred to Greek trade. The greatest exploit of the Assyrian monarch Esarhaddon was the conquest of Egypt. The land had been split up into an endless number of small kingdoms, and the kings continued to govern as vassals of Assyria. But the foreign domination did not last for much more than a quarter of a century. One of the kings, Psammetichus of Sais in Lower Egypt, probably of Libyan stock, revolted against Assurbanipal, who, in the last year of his reign, was occupied in subduing an insurrection of the Elamites of Susiana. We have seen how mail-clad soldiers of Ionia and Caria were sent by the lord of Lydia to assist Psammetichus. With the help of these bronze men who came up from the sea, he reduced the other kings and brought the whole of Egypt under his sway. This Libyan dynasty kept Sais as their capital, and their power was supported by foreign mercenaries, Greeks and Carians, Syrians and Phoenicians. Psammetichus built the fortress of Daphne, for so Greek speech graciously altered into Greek shape the Egyptian name Dephene, and entrusted it to his Greek soldiers. Relics of this foreign garrison have been dug up among the ruins of Daphne. Psammetichus and his successors completely departed from the narrow Egyptian policy of the pharaohs, and were the forerunners in some respects of the Greek dynasty of the Ptolemies, who 3 centuries hence were to rule the land. They opened Egypt to the trade of the world, and allowed Greeks to settle permanently in the country. Necho, the son of Psammetichus, connected the Red Sea with the Nile by a canal, and began a work which it was reserved for our own time to achieve, the cutting of a channel through the isthmus which parts the Red Sea from the Mediterranean. His war fleet sailed both in the Cypriot and in the Arabian seas, and a party of Phoenician explorers sent out by him accomplished the circumnavigation of Africa, a feat which 2,000 years later was regarded as a wild dream. The Milesians founded a factory on the western or Canobic channel of the Nile, not very far from Sais, and around it a Greek city grew up, which received the name of Naucratis, Sea Queen. This colony became the haven of all Greek traders, for though at first they seem to have moved freely, restrictions were afterwards placed upon them, and they were not permitted to enter Egypt except by the Canobic mouth. At Naucratis the Milesians, the Samians, and the Aeginetans had each their own separate quarter and their own sanctuaries. All the other Greek settlers had one common enclosure called the Hellenion, girt by a thick brick wall and capable of holding 50,000 men. Here were their market-place and their temples. All the colonists of Naucratis were Greeks of the Asiatic coast, whether Ionians, Dorians, or Aeolians, excepting alone the Aeginetans. Egypt, as we see, offered a field not only for traders but for adventurous soldiers, and thus helped to relieve the pressure of overpopulation in Ionia. At Abu Simbel in Upper Egypt we have a relic of the Greek mercenaries who accompanied King Psammetichus II, Necho's successor, in an expedition against Ethiopia. Some of them scratched their names on the colossal statues of the temple, and the very triviality of this relic at such a distance of time perhaps makes it the more interesting. End of chapter 2, part 6. Chapter 2, part 7. Cyrene. Not long after Egypt was thrown open to Greek trade, there arose to the west of Egypt a new Greek city. Civil dissension in the island of Thera between the older population, who called themselves by the obscure name of Mainyi, and the later Dorian settlers, led to an emigration of the Mainyi, some Dorians among them, and the exiles, having increased their band by Cretan adventurers, sailed for the shores of Barca. They made their first settlement on the little island of Plataea off the coast, their second on the opposite coast of the mainland, and when this too proved a failure, they founded their abiding settlement about 8 miles from the sea, near an abundant spring of water, on 2 white hills which commanded the encompassing plain. The city was named Cyrene, and it was the only Greek colony on the coast of Africa which attained to eminence and wealth. The man who led the island folk to their new home became their king. His name seems to have been Aristoteles, but he took the strange name of Battus, which is said to mean king in the Libyan language, while its resemblance to the Greek word for stammer gave rise to the legend that Battus I stammered in his speech. His son was Archesilas, and in the line of the Cyrenian kings Battus and Archesilas succeeded each other in alternation. Under Battus II the new city was reinforced by a large incoming of new settlers whom he invited chiefly from the Peloponnese and Crete, and this influx changed the character of the place, since the original Mainian element was outnumbered. The lands which the Greeks took from the Libyan inhabitants were made fruitful by the winter rains. Pindar describes them as plains over which dark clouds hover. There was excellent pasturage, and the men of Cyrene became famous for rearing horses and for skill as riders and charioteers. They were naturally the intermediaries between Greek merchants and the Libyan natives. But the chief source of the wealth of the Cyrenian kings was the export of Silphium, a plant which acquired a high repute for medicinal virtues. In those days it grew luxuriantly in the regions of Barca. Now it is extinct. The sale of Silphium was a monopoly of the king, and on a fine Cyrenian cup we can see Archesilas II himself watching the herb being weighed and packed. It was in the reign of this king that Barca was founded farther west. He quarrelled with his brothers, and they left Cyrene and founded a town for themselves. Cyrene held her head high in the Greek world, though she was somewhat apart from it. A Cyrenian poet arose and continued the Odyssey and described the last adventures of Odysseus. His poem was accepted by Greece as winding up the epic cycle which was associated with the name of Homer. His work was distinguished by local pride and local colouring. He gave Odysseus a son, Archesilaus, and connected the royal line of Cyrene with the great wanderer. And he introduced a flavour of those Libyan influences which modified Cyrenian civilization, just as the remote cities of the Euxine received influences from Scythia. End of chapter 2, part 7. Chapter 2, part 8. Popular discontent in Greece. The advance of the Greeks in trade and industry produced many consequences of moment for their political and social development. The manufactures required labour, and a sufficient number of free labourers was not to be had. Slaves were therefore indispensable, and they were imported in large numbers from Asia Minor and Thrace and the coasts of the Euxine. The slave trade became a profitable enterprise, and the men of Chios made it their chief pursuit. The existence of household slaves, generally war captives, such as we meet in Homer, was an innocent institution which would never have had serious results. But the new organized slave system which began in the 7th century was destined to prove one of the most fatal causes of disease and decay to the states of Greece. At first the privileged classes of the aristocratic republics benefited by the increase of commerce, for the nobles were themselves the chief speculators. But the wealth which they acquired by trade undermined their political position, for, in the first place, their influence depended largely on their domains of land, and when industries arose to compete with agriculture, the importance of land necessarily declined. In the second place, wealth introduced a new political standard, and aristocracies resting on birth tended to transform themselves into aristocracies resting on wealth. The proverb, "money makes the man," now came into vogue. As nobility by birth cannot be acquired, whereas wealth can, such a change is always a step in the direction of democracy. On the other hand, the poorer freemen at first suffered. How heavily the transition from the old systems of exchange to the use of money bore upon them we shall find illustrated when we come to the special history of Athens. But their distress and discontent drove them into striving for full political equality, and in many cases they strove with success. The second half of the 7th century is marked in many parts of Greece by struggles between the classes, and the wiser and better of the nobles began themselves to see the necessity of extending political privileges to their fellow citizens. The centralization in towns, owing to the growth of industries and the declining importance of agriculture, created a new town population, and doubtless helped on the democratic movement. In this agitated period lived a poet of great genius, Archilochus of Paros. It has been truly said that Archilochus is the first Greek of flesh and blood, whom we can grasp through the mists of antiquity. Son of a noble by a slave mother, he tried his luck among the adventurers who went forth to colonize Cyrus in Italy, but he returned having won an experience of seafaring which taught him to sing of the bitter gifts of Poseidon and the mariner's prayers for "sweet home." Then he took part in a Parian colonization of Thasos, and was involved in party struggles which rent the island. It must have been at Thasos that he witnessed an eclipse of the sun at noontide, which he describes, and this gives us, as a date in the Thasian period of his life, the 6th of April, 648 B.C., the first exact date we have bearing on the history of Greece. "All the evils of all Hellas are here," he exclaims, and Thasos is not a fair place nor a desirable, like the land round the stream of Cyrus. He announces that he is the servant of the Lord of Battle, and skilled in the delicious gift of the Muses. But when he fought in a war which the Thasians waged with the Thracians of the opposite coast, he ran for his life and dropped his shield. "Never mind," he said, "I will get me another as good." Poor, with a stain on his birth, tossed about the world, soured by adversity, Archilochus in his poetry gave full expression to his feelings, and used it to utter his passionate hatred against his enemies, such as the Parian Lycambes, for instance, who refused him his daughter Neobule. Had fortune favoured him, he would have been a noble of the nobles. Ill luck drove him to join the movement against aristocracy. His poems present a complete contrast to the epic style, and even to Hesiod. He addressed himself to the people, sang to the flute instead of the lyre, used colloquial language, and perfected iambic and trochaic measures for literary purposes. His influence may be judged from the fact that his poems were recited by the rhapsodes along with Homer and Hesiod. The ills of Greece, which were reflected in the poems of Archilochus, were to lead to the development of equality and freedom. But success in the struggle would in most cases depend on military efficiency, and a revolution in the art of warfare, which was brought about at the same period, was therefore of immense importance. This takes us to the history of Sparta. End of Chapter 2, Part 8. Recording by Graham Redman.
One of a History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 3. The Growth of Sparta and the Fall of the Aristocracies. Part 1. Sparta and her Constitution. The Dorian settlers from the north, who took possession of the valley of the Eurotas, established themselves in a number of village communities throughout the land, and bore the name of Lacedaemonians. In the course of time a city-state grew up in their midst, and won dominion over the rest. The town was formed by the union of 5 villages, which, after their union, still continued to preserve their identity as separate units within the larger unity. The city was called Sparta, and took the dominant place in Laconia, which had been formerly held by Amclea. The other Lacedaemonian communities were called the Parisii, or dwellers round about the ruling city, and though they were free and managed their local affairs, they had no political rights in the Spartan state. There is some evidence that in later times they were under the supervision of Spartan Harmosts, but even this evidence chiefly concerns the island of Cythera, which from a military point of view required special arrangements. The chief burdens which fell on them were military service and the farming of the royal dominions. The Spartans were always noted for their conservative spirit. Hence we find in their constitution, which was remarkable in many ways, survivals of an old order of things which existed in the days of Homeric poetry, but has passed away in most places when trustworthy history begins. The most striking of these survivals was royalty. Sparta was nominally ruled by kings. This conservative spirit of the Spartans rendered them anxious to believe and others willing to accept the view that their constitution had existed from very ancient times in just the same shape and feature which it displayed in the days of recorded history. We are, however, forced to suspect that this was not the case. There can be little doubt that the Spartan state developed up to the end of the 7th century on the same general lines as other Greek states, though with some remarkable peculiarities. There can be little doubt that, like most other states, it passed through the stages of royalty and aristocracy, and that the final form of the constitution was the result of a struggle between the nobles and the people. The remarkable thing was, that throughout these changes, hereditary kingship survived. The machine of the Spartan constitution, as we know it when it was fully developed, had 4 parts: the kings, the council, the assembly, and the ephors. The first 3 are the original institutions, which were common, as we saw, to the whole Greek race. The ephors were a later institution, and were peculiar to Sparta. We saw that towards the end of the Homeric period the powers of the king were limited, and that this limited monarchy then died out, sometimes leaving a trace behind it, perhaps in the name of a magistracy, like the King Archon at Athens. In a few places it survived, and Sparta was one of them. But if it survived here, its powers were limited in a twofold way. It was limited not only by the other institutions of the state, but by its own dual character. For there were 2 kings at Sparta, and had been since the memory of men. It seems possible that the origin of this double kingship lay in the coalition of 2 distinct communities, each of which had its own king. One tribe dwelt about Sparta, and its kings belonged to the clan of the Aegidae. The other tribe, we may guess, was settled somewhere in southern Laconia, and its royal clan was that of the Eurypontid. These 2 tribes must have united to form a large city-state at Sparta, and the terms of the union may have been that neither tribe should give up its king, but 2 kings with co-equal authority should rule over the joint community. The kingship passed from father to son in the 2 royal houses of the Aegids and the Eurypontids, and if the Aegid kings possessed a slight superiority in public estimation over their colleagues, this may have been due to the fact that the Eurypontids were the strangers who migrated to Sparta. According to a pedigree which was made out for them in later days, when the myth of the return of the Heraclidae had become current, both dynasties trace themselves back to Hercules. It seems probable that it was partly because there were 2 kings, the one a check upon the other, that kingship was not abolished in Sparta or reduced to a mere magistracy, but the powers of the kings were largely curtailed, and we may suppose that the limitations were introduced by degrees during that epoch in which, throughout Greece generally, monarchies were giving way to aristocratic republics. Of the religious, military, and judicial functions which belonged to them and to all other Greek kings, they lost some and retained others. They were privileged to hold certain priesthoods. They offered solemn sacrifices for the city every month to Apollo. They prepared the necessary sacrifices before warlike expeditions and battles. They were priests, though not the sole priests of the community. They were supreme commanders of the army. They had the right of making war upon whatever country they chose, and penalties were laid on any Spartan who presumed to hinder them. In the field they had unlimited right of life and death, and they had a bodyguard of 100 men. It is clear that these large powers were always limited by the double nature of the kingship, but at a later period it was defined by law that only one of the kings, to be chosen on each occasion by the people, should lead the army in time of war, and moreover they were made responsible to the community for their conduct in their campaigns. But while they enjoyed this supreme position as high priests and leaders of the host, they could hardly be considered judges any longer. The right of dealing out dooms like the Homeric Agamemnon had passed away from them. Only in 3 special cases had they still judicial or legal powers. They presided at the adoption of children. They decided who was to marry an heiress whose father had died without betrothing her. And they judged in all matters concerning public roads. There were royal domains in the territory of the Parisii, from which the kings derived their revenue. But they also had perquisites at public sacrifices. On such occasions they were, like Homeric kings, given the first seat at the banquet, were served first, and received a double portion of everything, and the hides of the slaughtered beasts. The pious sentiment with which royalty, as a hallowed institution, was regarded, is illustrated by the honours which were paid to the kings when they died. Horsemen, says Herodotus, carry round the tidings of the event through all Laconia, and in the city women go about beating a cauldron, and at this sign 2 free persons of each house, a man and a woman, must put on mourning garb, and if any fail to do this, great pains are imposed. The funeral was attended by a fixed number of the Parisii, and it was part of the stated ceremony that the dead king should be praised by the mourners as better than all who had gone before him. Public business was not resumed for 10 days after the burial. The king was succeeded by his eldest son, but a son born before his father's ascension to the kingship had to give way to the eldest of those who were born after the accession. If there were no children, the succession fell to the nearest male kinsman, who was likewise the regent in the case of a minority. The Gerontes, or elders, whom we find in Homer advising the king, and also acting as judges, have developed at Sparta into a body of fixed number, forming a definite part of the constitution, called the Gerousia. This council consisted of 30 members, including the 2 kings, who belonged to it by virtue of their kingship. The other 28 must be over 60 years of age, so that the council was a body of elders in the strict sense of the word. They held their office for life, and were chosen by acclamation in the general assembly of citizens, whose choice was supposed to fall on him whose moral merits were greatest. Membership of the council was described as a prize for virtue. The council prepared matters which were to come before the assembly. It exercised as an advising body a great influence on political affairs, and it formed a court of justice for criminal cases. But though the councillors were elected by the people, they were not elected from the people. Nobility of birth retained at Sparta its political significance, and only men of the noble families could be chosen members of the council. And thus the council formed an oligarchical element in the Lacedaemonian constitution. Every Spartan who had passed his 30th year was a member of the Apella, or assembly of citizens, which met every month between the bridge of Babyca and the stream of Cachion. In old days, no doubt, it was summoned by the kings, but in historical times we find that this right has passed to the ephors. The assembly did not debate, but having heard the proposals of kings or ephors, signified its will by acclamation. If it seemed doubtful to which opinion the majority of the voices inclined, recourse was had to a diversion. The people elected the members of the Gerousia, the ephors, and other magistrates, determined questions of war and peace and foreign politics, and decided disputed successions to a kingly office. Thus, theoretically, the Spartan constitution was a democracy. No Spartan was excluded from the appella of the people, and the will of the people expressed at their appella was supreme. To the people, runs an old statute, shall belong the decision and the power. But the same statute granted to the executive authorities, the elders and magistrates, a power which restricted this apparent supremacy of the people. It allowed them to be seceders if the people make a crooked decree. It seems that the will of the people, declared by the acclamations, did not receive the force of law, unless it were then formally proclaimed before the assembly was formally dissolved. If the elders and magistrates did not approve of the decision of the majority of the assembly, they could annul the proceedings by refusing to proclaim it, seceding and dissolving the meeting, without waiting for the regular dissolution by king or euphor. The 5 euphors were the most characteristic part of the political constitution of Sparta. The origin of the office is veiled in obscurity. It was supposed to have been instituted in the first half of the 8th century. The Alexandrians seem to have a euphor list, reaching as far back as 757 B.C., but we cannot build much on this. It is perhaps of more importance that the Euphrote existed in the Laconian colony at Thera, but what most of all proves its antiquity is its close interconnection with the whole framework of the Spartan constitution. But we must distinguish between the first institution of the office and the beginning of its political importance. It is probable that, in the course of the 8th century, the kings, finding it impossible to attend to all their duties, were constrained to give up the civil jurisdiction, and that the euphors, or overseers, were appointed for this purpose. The number of the euphors would seem to be connected with the number of the 5 dems or villages whose union formed the city, and perhaps each one of the euphors was assigned originally to one of the villages. But it cannot have been till the 7th century that the euphors won their great political power. They must have won that power in a conflict between the nobility who governed in conjunction with the kings, and the people who had no share in the government. In that struggle the kings represented the cause of the nobility, while the euphors were the representatives of the people. A compromise, as the result of such a conflict, is implied in the oaths which were every month exchanged between the kings and the euphors. The king swore that he would observe the laws of the state in discharging his royal functions; the euphor that he would maintain the royal power undiminished, so long as the king was true to his oath. In this ceremony we have the record of an acute conflict between the government and the people. The democratic character of the euphorate appears from the fact that any Spartan might be elected. The mode of election, which is described by Aristotle as very childish, was practically equivalent to an election by lot. When the 5 euphors did not agree among themselves, the minority gave way. The euphors entered upon their office at the beginning of the Laconian year, which fell on the first new moon after the autumnal equinox. As chosen guardians of the rights of the people, they were called upon to watch jealously the conduct of the kings. With this object 2 euphors always accompanied the king on warlike expeditions. They had the power of indicting the king, and summoning him to appear before them. The judicial functions which the kings lost passed partly to the euphors, partly to the council. The euphors were the supreme civil court. The council, as we have seen, formed the supreme criminal court. But in the case of the Parisii, the euphors were criminal judges also. They were moreover responsible for the strict maintenance of the order and discipline of the Spartan state, and when they entered upon office, they issued a proclamation to the citizens to shave their upper lips and obey the laws. This unique constitution cannot be placed under any general head, cannot be called kingdom, oligarchy, or democracy, without misleading. None of these names is applicable to it, but it participated in all three. A stranger who saw the kings going forth with power at the head of the host, or honoured above all at the public feast in the city, would have described Sparta as a kingdom. If one of the kings themselves had been asked to define the constitution, it is probable that he would have regretfully called it a democracy. Yet the close council, taken from a privileged class, exercising an important influence on public affairs, and deferring to an assembly which could not debate, might be alleged to prove that Sparta was an oligarchy. The secret of this complex character of the Spartan constitution lies in the fact that, while Sparta developed on the same general path as other states, and had to face the same political crises, she overcame each crisis with less violence, and showed a more conservative spirit. When she ought to have passed from royalty to aristocracy, she diminished the power of the kings, but she preserved hereditary kingship as a part of the aristocratic government. When she ought to have advanced to democracy, she gave indeed enormous power to the representatives of the people, but she still preserved both hereditary kings and the council of her nobles. Part II. Spartan conquest of Messenia. In the growth of Sparta the first and most decisive step was the conquest of Messenia. The southern portion of the Peloponnesus is divided into two parts by Mount Taygetus. Of these, the eastern part is again severed by Mount Parnon into two regions, the vale of the river Eurotas, and the rugged strip of coast between Parnon and the sea. The western country is less mountainous, more fruitful, and blessed by a milder climate, nor is it divided in the same way by a mountain chain. The hills rise irregularly, and the river Parmesus waters the central plain of the Steinclaris, where the Greek invaders are said to have fixed their abode. The natural forces of the country was the lofty rock of Ithome, which rises to the west of the river. It is probable that under its protection a town grew up at an early period, whose name, Messenia, was afterwards transferred to the whole country. The fruitful soil of Messenia, good to plant and good to ear, as the Spartan poet sang, could not but excite the covetousness of her martial neighbours. It is impossible to determine the date of the first Messenian war with greater precision than the 8th century. Legends grew up freely as to its causes and its course. All that we know with certainty is that the Spartan king, under whose auspices it was waged, was named Theopompus; that it was decided by the capture of the great fortress Ithome, and that the eastern part of the land became Laconia. A poet writing at the beginning of the 7th century would have naturally spoken of Messenia, or Pheræ, as being in Lacedaemon. When the second war broke out towards the end of the 7th century, it was either history or legend that the previous war had lasted 20 years. Legends grew up around it, in which the chief figure was a Messenian hero, named Aristodemus. The tale was that he offered his daughter as a sacrifice to save his country, in obedience to the demand of an oracle. Her lover made a despairing effort to save her life by spreading a report that the maiden was about to become a mother, and the calumny so incensed Aristodemus that he slew her with his own hand. Afterwards, terrified by evil dreams and portents, and persuaded that his country was doomed, he killed himself upon his daughter's tomb. As the object of the Spartans was to increase the number of the lots of land for their citizens, many of the conquered Messenians were reduced to the conditions of helots, and servitude was hard though their plight might have been harder. They paid to their lords only 1/2 of the produce of the lands which they tilled, whereas in Attica, at the same period, the free tillers of the soil had to pay 5/6. The Spartan poet, Tyrtaeus, describes how the Messenians endured the insolence of their masters. As asses worn by loads intolerable, so them did stress of cruel force compel, of all the fruits the well-tilled land affords, the moiety to bear to their proud lords. For some generations they submitted patiently, but at length, when victorious Sparta felt secure, a rebellion was organized in the northern district of Andania. The rebels were supported by their neighbours in Arcadia and Pisatis, and they are said to have found an able and ardent leader in Astromenus, sprung from an old Messenian family. The revolt was at first successful. The Spartans fared ill, and their young men experienced the disgrace of defeat. The hopes of the serfs rose, and Sparta despaired of recovering the land. But a leader and a poet arose amongst them. The lame Tertius is recorded to have inspired his countrymen with such martial vigour that the tide of fortune turned, and Sparta began to retrieve her losses and recover her reputation. Some scraps of the poems of Tertius have been preserved, and they supply the only trustworthy material we have for the history of the Messenian wars. And he won such fame by the practical success of his art, that at a later time the Athenians sought to claim him as one of their sons, and give out that Sparta, by the counsel of an oracle, had sent for him. The warriors advanced to battle singing his marches, to the sound of flutes, while his elegies, composed in the conventional epic dialect, are said to have been recited in the tents after the evening meal. But we learn from himself that his strategy was as effective as his poetry, and the Messenians were presently defeated in the battle of the Great Fosse. They then retired to the northern stronghold of Air on the river Nedon, which plays the same part in the second war that Ithome played in the first, while Astramenus takes the place of Astradamus. As to Air, indeed we possess no record on the contemporary authority of Tyrtaeus, whose extant fragments notice none of the adventures, nor even the name, of the hero Astramenus. Yet Air may well have been the place where the last stand was made, for the Spartans had raised the fortifications of Ithome, which is not mentioned in connection with the second war. At Air the defenders were near the Arcadian supporters, and within reach of Pylos, which seems not to have been yet Lacedaemonian. But Air fell. Legend says that it was beleaguered for 8 years. Astramenus was the soul of the defence, and his wonderful escapes became the argument of a stirring tale. On one occasion he was thrown, with 50 fellow countrymen, captured by the Spartans, into a deep pit. His comrades perished, and Astramenus awaited certain death. But by following the track of a fox he found a passage in the rocky wall of his prison, and appeared on the following day at Air. When the Spartans surprised that fortress, he made his escape wounded to Arcadia. He died in Rhodes. But 250 years later, on the field of Leuctra, he reappeared against the Spartans to avenge his defeat. Those Messenians who were left in the land were mostly reduced again to the condition of helots, but the maritime communities, and even a few in the interior, remained free, as Parisii, in the possession of their estates. Many escaped to Arcadia, while some of the inhabitants of the coast towns may have taken ship and sailed to other places. At this time Sparta, like most other Greek states, suffered from domestic discontent. There was a pressing land question, with which Tertius dealt in a poem named Eunomia, or Law and Order. These questions were partly solved by the conquest of the whole land of Messenia, and doubtless the foundation of the colony in Terrace, in southern Italy, was undertaken for the purpose of relieving an excessive population. The Messenian war, as recorded by Tertius, shows us that the power of the privileged classes had already been undermined by a great change in the method of warfare. The fighting is done, and the victory won, by regiments of mailed foot lancers, who march and fight together in close ranks. The secret had been discovered that such well-drilled spearsmen, hoplites as they were called, were superior to cavalry, and much about the same period in Ionia we find the infantry of Smyrna holding their own against the Lydian horsemen of Gyges. The recognition of serried bodies of foot as a useful weapon in battle can be traced in the later parts of the Iliad. But it was in Sparta first that their value was fully appreciated. There they became the main part of the military establishment. The city no longer depended chiefly on her nobles in times of war, she depended on her whole people. The progress of metalsmiths in their trade, which accompanied the general industrial advance of Greece, rendered possible the transformation in the art of war. Every well-to-do citizen could now provide himself with an outfit of armor, and go forth to battle in panoply. The metal breastplate had been introduced. Metal greaves were worn, and thigh pieces. The round shield borne on the arm had superseded the clumsy shoulder-swing shield of the heroic period. The transformation was distinctly levelling and democratic, for it placed the noble and the ordinary citizen on an equality in the field. We shall not be wrong in connecting this military development with those aspirations of the people for a popular constitution, which resulted in the investment of the Euphrates with its great political powers. From Sparta, where it was brought to a perfection which in the days of Tertius it had not yet attained, the institution of the heavy foot lancers spread throughout Greece, and its natural tendency everywhere was to promote the progress of democracy. It is significant that in Thessaly, where the system of hoplites was not introduced, and cavalry was always the kernel of the army, democratic ideas never made way. CHAPTER 4